Yeah, turn it on. As several people have noted, that we've crossed a watershed in terrorist considerations with the festivities of last March 20 in Tokyo. And Japanese always do things with great enthusiasm. And this includes their terrorist activities too. May I have the first view graph? We had one of our bright young chemists, Annette Watson, collect available information on the Tokyo incident, looking at, okay, who has control of the focus? You must have. And Annetta, with incredible courage, let me take her colored view graphs here to this meeting. This was a last-minute addition that we stuck in because of the apparent interest in the Japanese event. You have the next slide, please. Well, the slide is self-explanatory. The slide is self-explanatory, though I don't imagine it comes out very well on tape. The incident started at 7 o'clock on a Monday morning. Three lines were attacked. I think 5 cars were attacked with some variant of Tabun, GB. May I have the next slide, please? This slide shows the arrangement of the rail lines in Tokyo. They converge down toward this area here. The 3 lines were contaminated at some distance from the center of town, and the planning apparently was that the trains would all arrive at the same place downtown at the height of the rush hour, with a lot of casualties from nerve agents in the trains. One of the amazing things about this whole episode is the small number of casualties. There were only about 8 or 10 that were killed finally, and some 5,000 were, quote, injured. They were affected to some degree. May I have the next slide, please? They reacted very quickly. They had a couple of medical doctors in one of the hospitals that recognized the early reports of the nerve agent affecting the people, and correctly identified the agents and identified available stocks of atropine for treatment of the victims. And as a result, countermeasures were taken very quickly, and I think contributed very much to this extraordinary low loss of life. And naturally, it stopped traffic on all 3 subways. May I have the next slide? We spent some time trying to figure out what these guys had done, and from the reports, apparently they had no effective dissemination mechanism. They just had packages with the nerve agent in the package, and the interior container was ruptured or pierced, and the agent leaked out through the outer wrapping on the package and spread out on the floor. Now that is a very inefficient method of spreading around nerve gas. What you want to do is get it up in the air as a finely divided material and have it blow around. People get much heavier dose. It's doubtful that more than 1% or so of that agent ever became airborne. And the exposure was largely vapor exposure, so that when people left the area, walked out in the open air, their clothing was able to evaporate traces of agent into the air, and as a result, people got much less than if they had been in a closed area. May I have the next slide, please? Nerve agent GB, when properly prepared or purified properly, is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. Several people or groups reported quote, horrible smell from this stuff. We speculate that it may be some solvent that is used. Also, they apparently didn't have a very pure material. The other amazing thing was that the police announced what the material was within hours, in fact, probably within minutes of knowing. And you can imagine getting some response like that out of our bureaucracies. You have the next slide. This cooperation and non-obstruction seems to be characteristic of the Japanese, and it really reduced the time for people to get treated and undoubtedly contributed to the low loss of life. There was a very good network of the hospital emergency services in Tokyo, and they had a couple of MDs that, with experience in treating cholesterol inhibitor poisoning. We have the next slide. They cooperated to setting up emergency measures, tents outside the affected subways. One of the things that helped them the most, according to the medical, is that they had everybody in town, or everybody at the main hospitals, for the standard 9 a.m. staff meeting. So they weren't scattered all over the hospital or all over the city. They were right there in one place where everybody could be briefed and assigned. Some 267 treatment facilities were available in Tokyo. 80% of the patients were treated at one of the large hospitals. You have the next slide. Yeah, the two doctors that recognized this had treated an earlier attack in a different area and were very familiar with the symptoms of the Tobun poisoning. You have the next slide. Well, this isn't too visible. They, of course, had a range of exposures, severe to light, and they found I don't know what they're doing with so much atropine, but apparently they had plenty of that, and it was used well and contributed very much to the low casualties. Next slide, please. As of noon, the 21st of March, they had 8 dead. They had 4 more seriously injured who subsequently died. The most common identifiable effect was meiosis, the constriction of the pupils. This is really what to look for in nerve agent exposure or suspected nerve agent. It occurs at very low exposure. It's a very sensitive effect. You have the next slide. Well, this is a kind of a recapitulation of the system. It was passive volatilization of the agent, very inefficient dissemination, generally one agent source or package per individual subway car, which should be plenty. It should have killed everybody on those cars. But that poor dissemination, plus with the unknown airflow through the subway, helped. It must have had a forced ventilation system of very high capacity. Next slide, please. The response personnel were wearing full protective gear, were continually decontaminated with dilute bleach, which also helped coolant. That one of the unsolved problems with that protective gear is cooling or overheating. They decontaminated the subway cars in a matter of hours, had the lines running the next morning. Have the next slide. The Australian connection. This strange group that they have apparently had been running some kind of experiments using tabun in the central Australian desert. We have the next slide. I think it shows. The Lenora and Kalgoorlie, I love these Australian names, were down in the southwest, and this Japanese outfit had bought territory, had bought real estate down there, and had lived it, used it for a little bit less than a year, and then pulled out. And subsequently the Australians found dead sheep and traces of the hydrolysis products of nerve agent in the soil. Have the next slide. Now, the land was in their hands from August 1993 to September 1994. It's 500,000 acres near Leonora. It was 420 miles northeast of Perth. Desert and hot. Next slide. I think I've got one out of order here. Let's have the next slide, please. Okay. These are the conclusions. They found the antidotes worked very well. They had sufficient supplies available, and again, why the civilian hospital system had all this antidote, I don't know. They must use a lot of toxic sprays. They generally treated the contaminated people by stripping and washing them. In some cases, they returned their clothing with them in a plastic bag. You have the next slide. That's a little better. Well, this exercise provided impetus for the Japanese to ratify the chemical weapons treaty very shortly, I think within 10 days, after taking a number of years to consider it. It's now ratified by 28 nations. They need another 65 to make it binding. The U.S. is not ratified, but I expect it will very soon. Have the next slide, please. Good, we're through with our... Do you have any more of the colored ones?
There's the one that you said was out of order.
Oh. Okay, well, proceed. I'm not sure where we are. Looks like we've done that one. Well, we must be through the colored ones and into the black and white, or mostly black and white. Let's see what we've got. Okay. You know, I wish this thing were around so I could see the screen. This is some work we've been doing some years ago, a couple of years ago, on looking at the potential global importance of using biological weapons. And the biological weapons have been extremely important historically. The fact that the United States is now largely populated by descendants of Western Europe rather than Native Americans is due to the toxicity of effectiveness of smallpox organism, almost entirely, with a little help from some of the other ones. But it really changed the demographics of the North American continent. The government of Iraq attempted to use chemical agents against their Kurdish population prior to the Gulf War. And one of the things that's very interesting is the possible consequences of them attempting to use it against Israel, of the Iraqis attempting to use biological weapons against Israel. One would expect a very violent reaction, and the Israelis do have nuclear weapons. Pass along one observation I've made about all chemical, biological attacks, or use of chemical and biological agents. The one invariant of that is it has always been used against an adversary that had no retaliatory capability. No exceptions. And that goes back to World War I. The Germans first used it. The French had no retaliatory capability for releasing chlorine. And the Abyssinians and 1938, 39 had no capability to use mustard gas against the Italians. And the same thing is true today. It's physically possible to mount an attack on the United States by a nation the size of Iran or Iraq that could kill something like 35% of the population of the U.S. using some of these advanced agents. That is, our ace in the hole on this, as far as attacks by a constituted government or a national government, is that our submarines and alert SAC personnel at the missile bases breathe exclusively filtered air. There's no way to get to them, and if those folks are still around, you could imagine they'd be kind of irritable. Their families got knocked off. And they had some way of identifying who was responsible. And the person responsible might even make it easy for them to tell them. Have the next slide, please. Biological terrorism has some advantages over chemical terrorism. It's cheaper, or usually. Very small weight of an LD-50. If you get the stuff properly deployed in the wind and have wind from the right direction, and that is a very critical point that is often overlooked in biological organisms. You're completely dependent on the meteorology. With biological weapons, you can very often concoct a system where you have plausible deniability of the attack. And when I wrote this slide, there was no effective real-time detector for biological agents. There's now an effective detector. The Navy apparently has one, and there's been one developed by Los Alamos for the Army Chemical. And it seems to work pretty well. May I have the next slide? One of the interesting things is what global damage can be done to the United States by a big attack like that. If you kill 35% of the people, that will tend to disorganize the country somewhat, though not completely. It doesn't have to function like a military organization in the face of an adversary, generally. It might be facing a lot of uncontrolled immigration, but you would have an actual increase over the whole economy of the capital investment per capita. And this would tend to provide more flexibility in recovery. There are some sectors of the economy that are kind of narrowly located geographically. Petroleum refining, for example, military turbojet production, which is important in a war, but not in most of the terrorist incidents we're thinking about. And used to be nuclear weapons production was produced at a small number of sites. Now they're produced at no number of sites. They just have sinks for them at Pantex and other places. Next slide, please. I think, yes, here we go. This is a map that shows the location of all the petroleum refining areas in the country. As you can see, it's a very small fraction of the area of the United States. And it's generally spread around where it's pretty accessible to a low-flying cruise missile, or half a dozen low-flying cruise missiles to take out those areas. We have the next slide. Yeah, by the way, if we lost our petroleum refining capability, we would be in a difficult position as far as economic recovery. For historical purposes, I brought in a couple of our slides from some years back where we were doing experiments in dissemination. And I'm kind of big on that, because the efficiency of your use of agent depends on your efficiency of dissemination. And it's not as easy as you think. You'd like to get particles between 1 and 5 microns for maximum efficiency of inhaling the particles by the population downwind. And it's not easy to do that. There are some aerosol generators that do it, but you want something that's going to put out quarts per hour, and that's a lot more than most lab aerosol generators will do. Most agricultural nozzles or spray equipment makes particle sizes which are too large for efficient movement downwind of the aerosols. The agricultural sprays, they want to settle. They don't want them to go downwind. You want a 1 to 5 micron particle so that it'll go downwind. The other thing about this slide this is George Christie's head, his shirt, pants. This stud here is about 6 feet high. To give you a scale, you can just see this little plume out to about 3 or 4 feet. And if this were blown through a rear of a panel truck, you wouldn't be able to see that. May I have the next slide? Here's another view of that plume. That plume is putting out about 10 to the 14th lethal doses per minute, if I remember the number correctly. That's a lot. That could fog down a city in a few minutes. I have the next slide. Okay. This is a slide. It's a graphical representation of the factors involved in dissemination in a uniform atmosphere of aerosols of any mobility. Let's see. Or any what we call source strength, which is how many grams per mile you would disseminate through your equipment out the back of your pickup truck or your panel truck. And we have lines here for each of 5 meteorological conditions. Strong lapse condition, which is a turbulent atmosphere, sunlight. Moderate lapse condition, neutral atmosphere, which is most common, then moderate inversion and strong inversions. And these refer to conditions of the atmosphere where you get a warmer temperature atmosphere over a cooler temperature atmosphere and it represses convection so that your cloud tends to hang together and not get dispersed up where people can't breathe it. For this curve, we picked a lethal dose of 10 to the minus 8 grams, and that's about the dose for anthrax spores, about 10 to the minus 8 grams, about 10 to the 4th spores. This is our source strength on the y-axis. On the y-axis, we have plotted source strength. Could you slide this slide in that direction a little bit so we could see the, yeah, good. This is the what's called the normalized source strength, and grams per mile to get this downwind range, and that's 1 mile downwind range, that's 10 miles, that's 100 miles. And you get, if you had a source strength of, say, 10 grams per mile in a neutral atmosphere, it would give you about 5 miles downwind range. And these are logarithmic numbers, and they compress very rapidly. If you go up to 100 grams of source strength, 100 grams per mile. That's 100 grams spread out over a mile of interstate upwind of the city. That's a very small amount. If you had that in a neutral atmosphere up here, you'd have over 100 miles range. May I have the next slide? Oh, I won't take you all through this slide. This is some calculations of some hypothetical attacks. We looked at potential adversaries, individuals, domestic groups, government agents, foreign-sponsored groups, aircraft, ICBMs, and so on. Then made estimates of the various parameters, how much material, how is it spread out, how fast, over what area. The areas in square miles are over here, 25. And they get quite large, and we go up to numbers approaching the population of the United States. This was looking at a threat spectrum that covered everything from your lone terrorist with a backpack and an aerosol generator, or maybe a pickup or panel truck, and going all the way up to a cruise missile carrying a ton of agent, flying at 50 feet at 500 miles an hour with enough computational capacity on board to measure the winds, fly upwind of the pre-programmed targets, and even meter out the right source strength to handle that target. Until we learn a real good method of getting cruise missiles, of preventing cruise missiles, that's something else to worry about. So I certainly agree that our immediate problem is the terrorists, and even the lone terrorists. May I have the next slide? Back in 1979, there was a bunch of rumors came out of the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, that they had had an anthrax outbreak. The Soviet government said they, in fact, they had. It was due to some cattle that had died of anthrax and were sold on the black market. And people had eaten the meat and became infected with gastrointestinal anthrax. Well, there are a lot of people in the Soviet Union, or the medical people in the Sverdlovsk area, that were sure, particularly if they'd done the autopsies, that these dead people didn't die of gastrointestinal anthrax, they died of inhalation anthrax. And that's an indication that somebody's been playing around with war games. There were 96 cases in the Sverdlovsk area. The government claimed that these were intestinal, GI infections. There was a fierce international argument with Matthew Mazelson from Yale University taking the Russian side of it, that it really was contaminated meat and not an aerosol. Well, he did a yeoman job and went back and kept rechecking and plotting up the data, and it finally was apparent to him that it was an airborne infection. So it was an aerosol. It did come from one of the military laboratories, which they said was engaged in producing a better anthrax vaccine. There are a couple of very interesting things on this that I had not seen before. One was a very big onset curve. It was spread out over 6 weeks. And from other data, we are quite sure that the stuff was released in a single day. It didn't kill anybody over or under 40. And this had been noted by some people previously that I didn't know about. And that the people that were killed generally had been heavy users of alcohol and smoking, and were generally over 40. It looks very much like the Legionnaire's disease in Philadelphia back several years ago. You had the victims are almost invariably quite old. I should talk. People 60, 70, and heavy smokers, and a lot of them heavy drinkers. The Russian government finally admitted that, yeah, they had something there, and they immunized some 80% of the 59,000 people that were at risk in the downwind plume. They used the live non-encapsulated spore vaccine, which I suspect is probably very similar to one that we use. Or the one that we use is very similar to the one they used, because I think they were first. You have the next slide. One other very interesting thing on this is they had bright sunlight, neutral atmosphere. The agent survived the bright sunlight very well. It killed people. There were human infections produced as far as 4 kilometers downwind, and sheep killed down as much as I guess it was 50 kilometers. Yeah, 50 kilometers. Mazelson was able to back calculate the dose from this by making some assumptions which are all reasonable, and he concluded that between a gram and a few milligrams were released under these met conditions to produce that infection rate. The other thing about this that you don't see very much is that there's a tremendous spread of development of infection over a target population. You won't kill everybody when you hit an LD 50. With anthrax in humans or monkeys, to get from an LD 50 to an LD 90 or 92, you have to increase the dose that people absorb by a factor of 100. And where you can kill 50% of the population in a square mile with 8 or 10 grams of anthrax, if you want to kill 90% of them, you're going to need quite a bit more. You have the next slide. It isn't all hopeless. You have a few things working for us. Well, one of the big things to come out of the Japanese and other concerns, certainly discovery of the Iraqi supplies of botulism and anthrax, was motion on the U.S. government. Public health became very active. We'd been beaten on poor old FEMA for 30 years, saying, you guys got to worry about biological terrorism because you're more likely to see that than a nuclear war. And they say, sure, go away, kid, don't bother us. And we would give lectures at the various guidance committees, and nothing. But all of a sudden they're moving. This is a list of factors that the government committee that is dealing with this problem is working on. These include threat assessment, emergency consultation, public affairs, rapid deployment team for CB incidents similar to the NEST facility, agent identification, epidemiological investigations, expedient hazard detection, expedient hazard reduction, environmental decontamination, clinical medical support. I should mention something about contaminated landscape. That's a worrisome problem. Everybody talks about Grenard Island that was contaminated in 1940, early 40s, off the Scottish coast. And 2 years ago was turned back to the original owners. They had one little 8-foot square patch they had to sterilize with formaldehyde. But we have infected soil areas all over the United States. Virtually every area that has supported cattle at one time or another may have anthrax in the soil. And the way you handle that is you immunize your cattle and you immunize any people that have to go out and work in it. Resuspension is not bad when it's in soil. You don't get much. May I have the next slide? Oh, this is a list of things that you ought to consider if you're trying to develop countermeasures for a covert biological threat. Covert or biological, or I guess we would include chemical. You research open sources, find out who has the motives, who has the capability, what is the capability, develop information exchange agreements with foreign countries, friendly countries, infiltrate domestic groups, penetrate foreign groups, develop some improvised response, which is to deploy masks and have masks available. One of the things that you worry about in this is not the surprise attack out of the blue, but the threat, the public threat, that if you don't do thus and so, we're going to hose down your city with anthrax or whatever. You've got to be able to handle that. In some ways, that's a more threatening problem to the politician than the attack out of the blue or out of the night. Because if it's an attack, a surprise attack, they can't be blamed for it. But if it's a threat, then they've got to handle it publicly. And if they screw that up and get a lot of people killed, their career will be considerably shortened. We want to identify probable covert targets and launch areas, that is aerosol launch areas, upwind areas of these targets, and keep an eye on them. We should pressurize key buildings with HEPA filters, which is almost a complete protection for people in the buildings, not outside. We should obtain and deploy detectors, and that's quite an area in itself. We have the next slide. We want to have a good, we have a good data management system over most of the U.S., and they carried it to a much higher degree at the Army plants where they have chemical weapons that they're going to dispose. There are a variety of things and materials that can be obtained. Tone alert receivers and transmitters, masks, filters, protective clothing, sealing supplies. This is if you get a terrorist warning. Decontamination or decontaminating chemicals and equipment, vaccines and antibiotics where they're available. Immunize key people, and above all have a training program. We have the next slide. Let me introduce you to the Phantom vacuum cleaner produced by a small outfit in Toronto, Canada. It's unique in that it has an absolute filter on the discharge of the vacuum cleaner. And I had been for some years touting our improvised method of using a vacuum cleaner to pressurize a room with filtered air in a terrorist warning. But the Phantom company, which this was the first year I saw it, I bought their vacuum cleaner. And it's a great vacuum cleaner. Boy, it'll pick up dog hair like nothing you've ever seen. But also, they say that it's got a HEPA filter in the discharge. I have not tested that. There's one in there, and it's only about a half a square foot in area compared with 200 square feet in the standard 12 by 24 by 24 HEPA filter. But it certainly doesn't discharge any dust that I can detect. It costs about $300 and should be quite capable of running all night. It's a very heavy duty machine. Draws 13 amps when you've got it loaded. May I have the next slide? And if you want a specialized piece of equipment, there's the Sears and Roebuck Kenmore HEPA Supreme Air Cleaning System. This is the first year I've seen this on the market. It also has about a half a square foot HEPA filter in the thing. This also has a device for producing negative ions that's supposed to make your air smell fresher or be fresher. But these two commercial products, I have no doubt, are vastly superior to the old vacuum cleaner we were using to try and Bacillus globigii spores out of air, open air. That concludes anything I want to say in the way of prepared material. I'll be glad to try and answer any questions. I think it's right on time, but I'll stay here as long as anybody else wants to. Yes?
During the Gulf War, the Israelis prepared, say, one room of their house by putting plastic on the walls, and they didn't seem to have this kind of vacuum cleaner technology available to them to, say, positive pressure ventilation. How effective would that be against chem-bio as compared to, say, for instance, traditional Expedient fallout shelters?
Okay. Without any filtration, if you just have a leaky house with contaminated air blowing in it from the external wind and room contaminated air blowing out the other side, you have a lower concentration of aerosol in the house. It never gets up as high as it was outdoors, but it lasts a lot longer. It takes time for it to leak out, and that time that it takes for it to leak out is exactly mathematically equal, or the extra exposure for the time to leak out is exactly mathematically equal to the reduction in exposure due to the building. Now, if you put a filter on it, that's a whole different story. It depends on the efficiency of your filter. And that's another important point. Biological organisms are solid particles, always. Generally none smaller than a micron or so, certainly for bacteria. There are viruses that are smaller, but they are solid particles, and a HEPA filter will get them all. Chemical weapons can be vapor as well as solid or gas, and they'll leak through a HEPA filter. Yes?
Could you just explain quickly how to use that vacuum cleaner if you had a warning of biological attack?
Okay. You set it up outside your house in a garage or patio or someplace out of the rain and turn it on. You have it plugged in. You turn it on and you have your hose come in through a door or window pane or some opening to a room, which if you can line it with plastic, that's good, but you don't need to. This thing generates so much flow through the filter that it'll generally keep the contaminated ambient air out of your shelter or out of your room that you're pressurizing with the vacuum cleaner. What you want to do is fix the leaking so that the leaks are out, not in. And the room is kept filled with air that's gone through your HEPA filter on the vacuum cleaner. No more customers? Well, yes.
Since anything that gets in is especially dangerous if it stays in there,
Yes.
would an ozone generator kill the biological
Yes.
material?
So will ultraviolet bulbs. You can illuminate the area with ultraviolet germicidal lamps, and that's very effective in killing aerosols. It turns out that you kill most of your anthrax spores with about the same exposure that'll give a North European beginning sunburn. And that's how much ultraviolet radiation you need for anthrax. Now, if you're dealing with plague or some of these other more fragile organisms, they take orders of magnitude less ultraviolet or ozone to kill them. Anthrax is a spore and it's very rugged. Yes?
expressed some surprise at how well, effectively the Japanese dealt with the sarin attack.
Yes.
Especially the quantity of drugs that they had on hand to deal with it. Could you
Yes.
speculate on why they had so many, or were they expecting something like this?
Well, I don't know. The Japanese are great agriculturists, and they might like to use a lot of organophosphorus insecticides. No, I really don't know. It may have been part of their military supplies. They worry a lot about protecting their population from enemy action, based on a lot of hard luck about 50 years ago. That's something that's been the bane of our existence for the last 30 or 40 years, is trying to convince American politicians and authorities that the world has changed, and having the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean wrapped around us is like a security blanket. Doesn't carry the weight it once did. The Japanese have a very different historical perspective, and it might be that they have a store of agent to protect their whole population. Yes.
Same circumstance, just a different response. What would the casualty rate have been in New York City? The same thing happened.
Well, from the nerve gas, I would say maybe 500,000, and from the ensuing riot, maybe 3 million.